Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Larry Lederman, and I'm your MC for this event sponsored by the Center for International Governance Innovation, CIGI, located in Waterloo, Ontario. First, I would like to recognize some members of the diplomatic community. The newly arrived ambassador of the Dominican Republic, His Excellency Bruny Garabito Segura, the High Commissioner of Malaysia, Her Excellency Aminatun Dato Binti Haja Karim, and the Ambassador of Algeria, His Excellency Hossein Megar. And also members of the embassies of Costa Rica, the Netherlands, Mexico, Turkey, Israel, Russia, and South Africa. And I'm also pleased to welcome the President of CIGI, Dr. Rohinton Medora, and the President of the Pearson Center is with us, Andrew Cardoso. We also welcome members of Parliament, departments and agencies of the Government of Canada, including Global Affairs, Shared Services, Finance Canada, Innovation, Science and Economic Development. Much easier to say Industry Canada, but they changed the name. Statistics Canada and the media, and students and faculty of the University of Ottawa, Carleton University, and with us someone from the U.S. State Department visiting Ottawa today. And now I would ask Mr. Jacob Glick, Senior Executive Fellow at CIGI, to introduce our distinguished speaker.
Thanks. Thanks very much. My name is Jacob Glick. I'm a Senior Executive Fellow at CIGI. I actually get to wear many hats, one of which is that, one of which is also I'm a visiting Executive Fellow at the University of Ottawa, so I get to bridge both the host of tonight's event and the speaker for tonight's event. So it's a real pleasure for me to be introducing Professor Michael Geist this evening. Professor Geist is the Canada Research Chair in Internet and E-commerce Law at the Faculty of Law at the University of Ottawa. Professor Geist has spent nearly 2 decades being one of the global leaders in technology, law, and policy, making meaningful contributions to public policy and discourse, and really shaping that discourse around issues of copyright, privacy, telecom, consumer protection, online jurisdiction, and a host of other issues. And in that context, he's been both a meaningful contributor and confidant and gadfly to governments. He is also a huge sports fan, so I'd encourage you to ask him about the Blue Jays or the Seahawks. And he's been a friend and mentor for many years, and so it's really my pleasure to introduce Professor Geist. Thank you.
Great. Well, thanks so much, Jacob. As long as you don't ask me about Monday night's Seattle Seahawks game, we're good. Hang on, sorry, just a sec. Okay. Awesome. Well, thanks so much for the invitation to have the chance to come and speak, and thanks to all of you for braving a little bit the cold, but particularly the traffic for coming out. So I have the chance to talk a little bit about NAFTA and the digital environment, and I just wanted to preface that by noting that I come here today in part because I've made a couple of contributions now to some of CIGI's work. This is not working as it should. To some of CIGI's work, both with this piece here, as we took a look at innovation, and in particular around some of the copyright policies that come out of that, as well as in a second piece that looked at NAFTA. When people ask me, what do I focus on in my area of research, I talk at a sort of a general level about the intersection between law and technology. When it comes to CIGI and some of its incredible programs, there's an intersection between trade, innovation, and intellectual property that really hits, I think, a tremendous sweet spot. And it really resonates with me, and so it's been a real pleasure to have the chance to contribute both to those projects as well as here this evening. So with respect to NAFTA, I mean, the starting point I would go back is actually a little while. And note that things have changed. I think we all know that things have changed. Certainly the characters themselves have changed. But so too, I think it's fair to say, especially if we're focused on intellectual property, that's changed a lot as well. If we go back and take a look at what the first trade agreement looked like in terms of an intellectual property chapter, there actually wasn't a chapter, there was a provision. This was it. All it did was simply referenced that the parties would cooperate as part of the Uruguay round. And so there was very little. There were a number of other provisions within the Canada-US FTA that touch on copyright. There's a couple in there, the cultural industries provision, a retransmission provision, and the Print in Canada requirement. But it's fair to say, at least at that point in time, the notion that intellectual property would form a core part of a trade negotiation was largely absent. By the time we get to NAFTA, things change a little bit. This is what we get in NAFTA. It isn't nearly at the granular level that you often see in trade agreements today, but there certainly had been a progression in terms of the recognition that some of these issues increasingly do play a role as part of trade deals. By the time we get to things like TPP and the expectation that a renegotiated NAFTA will be based at least in part on some of the TPP provisions, we get far more detail, both in terms of intellectual property chapter, in terms of length and the detail within the annex and the like, and also with either a digital trade chapter, as I believe it's being called within NAFTA, or an e-commerce chapter, as it was called in the TPP. So trade talks have changed, no doubt, both in terms of obviously the cast of characters involved as well as in the substance when we think about it from an IP perspective. When I think about the NAFTA renegotiation and think specifically about the digital environment, its impact on innovation, on intellectual property, I want to make I want to make 3 points. The first is, I think, frankly, it is the wrong venue to be discussing these sorts of things. It's an argument I'm going to lose, I know. It's going to be there. But nevertheless, I think it's the wrong venue. If I had a choice, given that it's going to be part of NAFTA, then I would argue that we should solve, especially on IP, with a single provision, and I'll tell you what it is. I'm going to lose that argument, too. And so if we are faced with intellectual property chapters that are increasingly robust and detailed in the way that we're started to see, as well as an e-commerce digital trade chapter, I'm going to try to outline some of the kinds of things that I think we ought to be thinking about if we're going to try to have a balanced approach that is more reflective of Canadian policy. Let me start, though, with the case that I think it is the wrong venue. And I think the reason for that is that much of what we are talking about, especially when we talk about intellectual property, is fundamentally domestic reforms. They are not anymore about trading and tariffs and the kinds of issues that were your parents' or grandparents' trade agreements, and we're talking about trading in goods and lowering the various tariffs. It's now largely, especially around IP, in terms of economic regulation. And many of these issues are really domestic issues that I would argue ought to be resolved and debated domestically, not effectively imposed by way of trade deals. And to give you a couple of examples, I'll come back to fair dealing a bit more soon, but fair dealing is certainly one of the more contentious domestic copyright issues that we face in Canada. The U.S. raised it as an issue as part of their annual Special 301 report. This is their review of many countries' intellectual property rules in which they tell at least 70% of the global population that their IP rules don't meet U.S. standards. So just about everybody is on this list. Canada is on the list as well. And one of the things that they focus on, it's sort of in the middle there, is that the U.S. remains deeply concerned by what they say is a broad interpretation of an ambiguous education-related exception to copyright. Now, of course, they don't mention that the United States has a fair use provision that is far broader than the Canadian fair dealing provision, but I'll leave that to the side. And instead note that this is an issue of which there is, I think, a fair amount of room for debate about the appropriate approach. Now, in the Canadian context, I think it's been the impact of fair dealing has been dramatically overstated. The reality is that if you take a look at how people access materials in post-secondary institutions like mine, you find that there is a myriad of ways that they're doing that today. They do it in many instances by buying books. That hasn't gone away. Very often it's through database licensing. It's through open access, the publication of research that then that is made available openly. It's through de minimis, and our courts and Copyright Board has ruled that a page or two out of an 80-page text is de minimis and doesn't even need a fair dealing analysis. And sometimes it's from fair dealing itself. So there's a range of ways we access those materials, and there's room for debate around that. I'd note that we've had studies from the publishers themselves that when they're not lobbying government and policymakers, they will acknowledge that changes in the industry are driven not necessarily by copyright, but by a myriad of other sources, and myriad, whether that's database licensing or longer adoption cycles, a lot of different things. And in fact, if we take a look at the acquisition spending that is taking place today on university campuses, you find that since copyright reform in Canada in 2012, the amount of spending on licenses has gone up, not down. Now, you wouldn't hear that when you hear sort of some of the publishers and copyright collectives who speak of one license whose revenues have declined. But if you look at university after university, what you find is expenditures have gone up. And almost all of those expenditures, this is some of the StatsCan data, have come directly from licensing electronic books, e-books, and other databases on site that then can be used for course materials. Now, this is, I think, an important debate, one that we will have in Canada. But I would argue that I don't think it's entirely appropriate to have that debate within the Nafta negotiations. It's not that we need to solve this issue through Nafta. We need to solve it and debate it out in a Canadian context. Now, the same is true for the other partners in Nafta. In the United States, they are having at the moment a significant debate around a system known as notice and takedown. A system that's been in place for a long time in the United States that addresses the question of what happens when a rights holder believes that there's been infringing activity that's taken place, let's say on a well-known site, on a Facebook or YouTube or something like that, and what happens to that content. Now, in the last number of months, we've had, especially in the United States, rights holders argue that we ought to change the system, that the takedown system that was established in the 1990s wasn't designed for the internet of today. We've also seen intermediaries point out that the overwhelming majority of the requests that they get in some instances are fake. Google identified, for example, the fact that more than 99% in a single month that they took a look at, more than 99% of the requests that they were getting based on search results were for pages that never existed. They were, in a sense, fake takedown requests, which certainly juiced the numbers about the allegations of infringement online. They were pages that weren't there to take down. Now, I think there, too, there is a useful debate to be had about the effectiveness of notice and takedown. In Canada, we have something different known as notice and notice. But I don't think NAFTA is the right place to do it. And yet, when you take a look at the kinds of provisions that we find in these agreements, they are fundamentally involved in those sorts of domestic policy issues. But that's not the only reason that I think NAFTA is not an ideal place for this. There's also a transparency element that comes up in trade negotiations. If you take a look at how intellectual property in particular is addressed, especially at a global level, it's often at places like this, at the World Intellectual Property Organization. And at WIPO, there are NGOs, there are a range of other groups who can openly participate and be part of, in many instances, the drafting process. In fact, if we take a look back at how the last WIPO treaty was established, the Marrakesh Treaty that facilitated access for the blind and sight impaired, people around the world had access in real time to the various drafts as they were negotiating the treaty as part of the diplomatic conference in Marrakesh. It is fair to say that does not happen either in the TPP nor within NAFTA. I mean, we had NAFTA take place, obviously just wrapped up yesterday in Mexico. I wasn't invited, perhaps some people here were, but for the most part, we're not invited to these things. The public is not invited. We get reports back on what is taking place. But the transparency and openness that has long been, I think, a core part of how we have addressed IP policy is lost once you move it into the trade space. Yet another problem that we have when we bring these issues into the trade environment is a balancing problem. Now, many of you will know that when we talk about, say, copyright policy, we often talk about it in terms of striking a balance. Here's our former industry minister, back when it was industry, James Moore, behind you can see a very large banner talking about balanced copyright. Indeed, that's precisely how the government at the time tried to market copyright reform in Canada, arguing that they were trying to strike a balance. And that, I suspect, will be the same when we go through the various reforms in Canada as part of a review that is scheduled to start quite soon. When you move this into the trade environment, that's not what takes place. What happens is there is a balance, but it's a much different balance. It's now a balance between the intellectual property chapter, the rules of origin chapter, the ag chapter, the services chapter. There are a whole series of different interests in chapters, all of which in effect must be balanced out. And so losses, so to speak, let's say on intellectual property might be balanced by gains because we'll sell more pork and beef in a particular jurisdiction if we take a look at how things went through CETA. That leads, I would argue, to really potentially bad outcomes from a policy perspective because the very approach that we take within a domestic reform process in terms of trying to strike an appropriate balance to help foster innovation, for example, becomes lost in a trade environment because these issues become little more than a bargaining chip as which we play off and try to balance a range of other issues. Finally, I also think this is a bad idea to be engaged here because I think we lose the flexibility that typically exists around many of these issues within international treaties. So one of the most controversial issues comes up in the copyright area is rules around what's known as digital locks. It's technically refers to this, technological protection measures, and the legal protection that we provide for things like digital rights management that might be used to protect things like a DVD or an electronic book. And so we have legal rules that provide protection for essentially that technological protection around that content. Those rules come out of the World Intellectual Property Organization's Internet Treaties, which were crafted back in 1996, and the specific provision around the issue is this one here, talking about contracting parties providing adequate legal protection and effective legal remedies against circumvention, around getting around these technical protections. Now, countries around the world, including Canada, have implemented this particular provision. It's fairly general and broad, and so countries around the world adopt oftentimes some different approaches in terms of what they do with it. When we take this provision and we put it into a trade agreement, we often get something different. So this is what it looks like in the TPP context, Trans-Pacific Partnership context. Actually, I'm kidding. It doesn't just look like that. It looks like this and this and this. We took that one small paragraph in the World Intellectual Property Organization and turned it into all of this in terms of the kinds of obligations that we face. Now, this might be one country's interpretation of how they would like to see that single paragraph interpreted. In this case, it's the United States interpretation of that paragraph. But what it means is that the negotiated flexibility, the ability to achieve the consensus that we had back when we negotiated the treaty back in the 90s becomes lost because we become locked into provisions like this. And it's not just copyright. The same issue arises, for example, within the patent area, let's say around protections for biologics, a provision that has now been put on hold as part of the TPP. But one of the concerns was that if you specify particular length for protection of biologics, if you later come to the realization that it is new technology, incredibly innovative stuff, and perhaps you get that term wrong, the ability to undo it once it's put in a treaty is very, very difficult. In fact, even in the United States under the Obama administration, started with 12 years of protection. A number of years later, there was a realization within the Obama administration that they'd gotten it wrong. It was too long. They wanted to scale it back. Put it in a treaty, and it's almost impossible to make those kinds of changes. Now, the good news, I would say, is that our government has actually recognized that many of these provisions are problematic because they appeared in the TPP, and as many of you will know, negotiations that took place in Vietnam just a week or two ago, Canada specifically sought and was able to achieve a number of these very provisions to be suspended within the TPP, recognizing that, at least for now, we don't want to see a TPP, or we're not supportive of a TPP that includes those kinds of provisions. So I think that there is, from my perspective, there's room to argue that the same ought to be true in NAFTA, but I will acknowledge that that's an unlikely outcome. Given that we're going to, in all likelihood, include those provisions, I would, I guess, secondarily say, well, how about as an alternative then find a single provision? That single provision is one that I'm going to take directly out of the TPP, and it simply states that all parties have to meet international standards. Identify the various international treaties within intellectual property and say that all parties that are part of this agreement have to meet that standard. Because that truly is where international law is around intellectual property. And we can, as you can see here from the Trans-Pacific Partnership, identify the treaties that have set the standards around copyright, around patents, around trademarks. And leaving it at that level to say, we want everybody to meet the international standard, but we leave the flexibility for each country to implement as they see fit, consistent with their own domestic priorities, is precisely how international law structures it, and I would argue how we ought to be structuring it within a trade context as well. But I will also note that it is unlikely that that is an outcome too. So if we are going to be faced with IP and digital chapters within NAFTA, what would a balanced balanced provisions look like? Let me quickly go through a bunch, and then we'll throw it open to some questions and discussion. I would start with a balanced digital NAFTA would include provisions on balance. And in fact, within the Trans-Pacific Partnership, there were specific provisions that identified within intellectual property the need to interpret them within a balanced framework. Now, in fact, Canada and Mexico were both supportive. This comes out of the leaked TPP, one of the earlier leaked TPP versions, so we even get to see in square brackets which countries were supportive of the provisions and which were not. If you take a look at the very top, you will see that the United States was not. Canada and Mexico were. And so as part of NAFTA, I would argue that we ought to be at least arguing for similar kinds of provisions, talking about protection of the public domain, talking about balance. These were the kinds of higher level principles that the Canadian government, the Mexican government, indeed the vast majority of the TPP identified as priorities when bringing together the TPP. It ultimately didn't appear in the TPP, at least in this fashion, but it's one that we ought to revive if we're talking about these issues within a NAFTA context. We ought to also focus on copyright term. And on copyright term is another one of the areas that within the TPP 11, Canada has suspended a particular provision that would have required us to extend the term of copyright from what is currently the international standard within the Berne Convention. Canada meets that standard of life of the author plus 50 years to what the US standard is of life plus 70. Now, the truth is within NAFTA, all three parties have different terms. Mexico's at life plus 100 for reasons that are difficult to explain. The United States is at life plus 70, and Canada's at life plus 50. I'd argue that what is relevant is that all meet the international standard, and that really ought to be the standard that we meet. Now, there is a recognition, and I believe there was a recognition in the decision to support suspending it within the TPP, that should Canada extend the term, it comes at a significant cost. I flipped too quickly. New Zealand, when they examined this issue as part of participating in the TPP, conducted a study on the cost and said it would cost their economy millions of dollars to extend the term from where they are also at life plus 50 to life plus 70. Here in Canada, the cost is a cost, I would argue, not just economic, but even broader in terms of the impact it would have on society. I did a study recently that borrowed data from the Ontario Book Publishers Organization. They conducted a survey of school teachers and school districts from across the province of Ontario, asking English teachers in grades 7 through 12, what books are they using as part of their curricula? Now, their goal in the study was to make the case that there were not enough Canadian authors included in the curricula, and they pointed out that Canadian authors are still a fairly small portion of the books that are used. But looking at the data, I was interested in something different. How many of the books that are actively used in our classrooms in grades 7 through 12 are public domain books? Turns out, of the top 20 most popular books that are used in these grades, half are in the public domain. Now, there's this guy, William Shakespeare, who wrote a few things, and so no surprise that Shakespeare appears there a bunch of times, but it's not limited to Shakespeare. In fact, if you go through the full list, the 100 or more books that are out there, you find the public domain is an important part of the curricula in classrooms across the province, indeed across the country. Now, this becomes relevant because we also looked at the number of books that are scheduled to enter into the public domain within the next 20 years. And you find that there are dozens of those books that are scheduled to be available in the public domain, that could be incorporated and used in open electronic materials, could be used more flexibly in a number of different ways, and yet if we were to extend the term of copyright, would be locked down literally for decades. Now, if we have this digital NAFTA, we will have to deal with, or we likely will deal with fair use or fair dealing. We sometimes hear that Canada as fair dealing is offside. I referenced that a little bit earlier. Think of the children. I provided an alternative perspective that tells you that, in fact, that's simply not the case, that if anything, licensing is up, and indeed we could look at this across sectors. I put up a post just today that looked at the music industry that shows that within Canada, revenues from music streaming have grown dramatically since copyright reform in 2012. Canada is seeing dramatic growth, and in fact, far faster than the global average, with piracy rates that are far lower than the global average. All of this happening in the environment post-2012 as part of our copyright reform. We'd also have to take a look at those intermediary issues. What responsibility lies for various internet intermediaries? Canada has a system known as notice and notice, and it was included within the TPP. I think it's a system that generally has the right intentions and works fairly well, but I'd argue that there are fixes that we need in Canada, but if we're going to include it within NAFTA, these kinds of provisions, we need to ensure that it is viewed as it was in TPP, as an acceptable approach in terms of an intermediary meeting their responsibility both to preserve the privacy of their users and also to meet the needs of rights holders. If we talk about notice and takedown, though, let's recognize that notice and takedown can and has been subject to abuse. We are seeing, for example, I gave a talk yesterday at an academic conference on open education, and the focus of that talk was how we are seeing publishers and other groups increasingly trying to take down not movies, it's not Game of Thrones type issues, but quite literally using takedown demands for academic research, where oftentimes researchers will post their academic work, believing in many instances that they have the right to do so, and yet the takedown system is being used, especially in the United States, to now take down, in many instances, journal articles. That's not the sort of thing that I think we ought to see in NAFTA, nor in Canada. We'd also have to think about ensuring that the move to criminalize many of these kinds of copyright provisions, I think, is something that stays out of NAFTA. There's sometimes discussions around Canada having an online piracy problem, but I mentioned a moment ago, data that comes even from Music Canada, the lead lobby group for the music industry, notes that Canada stands below the global average in a survey that they commissioned, both in terms of people accessing and downloading music from unauthorized sites, as well as doing something known as stream ripping, which is taking music off of sites like YouTube and using it as a download. Canada below those averages with significant growth. Yet despite that, we've had some companies, including here in Canada, Bell Canada, for example, BCE, arguing that we ought to criminalize our approaches with respect to copyright. We've got tough penalties in Canada. Canada is in the minority of countries around the world that has statutory damages, with some of the toughest damages provisions to be found anywhere. Not as tough as the United States, but tougher than most countries that we deal with. Moving towards increased criminal provisions, I think, would be a mistake. We ought to talk about, within a digital NAFTA, those anti-circumvention provisions, eschewing the approach that we saw within the TPP that would remove flexibility, while also recognizing that these are the kinds of provisions that can have a negative impact on innovation. I talked to actually an agricultural group fairly recently who were pointing to concerns that Canadian farmers are having about their inability to sometimes fix their vehicles, their tractors and the like, because the vehicles themselves are essentially now a computer system, and to try to tinker with your tractor, oftentimes leased by farmers, is to actually have to circumvent it and to violate the law. Now, within many of those communities, the ability to even get somebody out into the community to fix the tractor can take time, because it has to be someone who is authorized from the company. And yet the response is, we can do this within our community, and it ought not be the case that we are somehow infringing copyright in order to do it. So too within the education context, where increasingly, as I mentioned, we spend more and more on electronic books and on databases, and yet run the risk of losing the fair dealing rights that we have, where those things become locked down, and we have anti-circumvention rules, digital lock rules, that restrict the ability to make use of those materials. That's a mistake, and one where flexibility ought to be included within those trade deals. There is, I mentioned damages a moment ago, damages are a concern. They're a concern because in some instances we have seen sites, including this one, Sci-Hub, which is a publisher of scholarly research, targeted for potentially millions in liability under the US damage system. Now, Canada included, as part of its 2012 reforms, a cap on liability for non-commercial infringement. It's had a significant impact for educational institutions who think about digitization programs or other groups that are engaged in different things for non-commercial purposes and no longer run the risk of thinking that you're going to bankrupt yourself or clean out your bank account due to a copyright case. Those are the kinds of approaches we took. Frankly, it's the sort of thing that we ought to see adopted North America-wide within NAFTA to distinguish between, on the one hand, damages that truly target piracy, and on the other hand, excluding from that ambit non-commercial activity with penalties for infringement, but not so severe that somehow We're creating an environment where people simply don't engage in activities due to outsized risk. Finally, within the copyright context, there has to be concerns about court judgments. From a Canadian perspective, if we think about a North American market, Canadian businesses often face significant risks due to the kinds of cases that we see coming out of courts in the United States. The incredible damages often will have a chilling effect on Canadian businesses who will look at that US market and say, those kinds of damage awards and represent risks that we can ill afford to take on. We've got similar challenges in a Canadian context and courts more generally with determining the scope of what courts ought to be doing, especially in an internet environment. We had in Canada, for example, a Supreme Court judgment involving Google, the Equistec case, in which it said that a Canadian court could issue an order requiring Google to remove search results not just for the Canadian users, but for users worldwide. What is the boundary that ought to exist for a court when it issues these kinds of orders? A California court, a federal court in California, has just issued, in a sense, a counter ruling at Google's request, saying that that order can't be enforced in the United States. Well, so suddenly now you've got Canadian courts ordering one thing, US courts ordering another. These are the kinds of issues that actually we ought to be dealing with if we are going to have these kinds of more robust provisions that recognize that court systems have a significant impact on what takes place. Quickly, I focused primarily on IP, but at least a few comments on some of the digital trade provisions, and start with the timeliest one of all, net neutrality. Anyone paying attention to the news today will know that the United States, under the FCC, has, for reasons that are tough to fully understand, I think, rolled back or planned to roll back the net neutrality protections that they have, described in the press throughout as being destroying net neutrality within the coming month. Now, in Canada, we have a much different approach. Indeed, this was a tweet from the ISED Minister Navdeep Bains just a few hours ago, talking about Canada continuing to stand for diversity and freedom of expression and remaining committed to the principles of net neutrality. In fact, the Prime Minister was asked this about an hour and a half ago, and he expressed his concern with what he sees as the undermining for net neutrality in the United States. Now, if we're talking about a digital trade provision for a North America-wide agreement, we need a net neutrality provision in Nafta, and we need one that is far more robust than the very weak net neutrality provision that was actually included in the TPP. It's not good enough to merely say we need net neutrality. Our businesses, our Canadian businesses, need to ensure that net neutrality will be respected, because one of the risks that Canadian businesses will face if they are doing business in the United States, given where they are moving on net neutrality, is if this two-tiered approach to the internet, a fast lane and a slow lane, emerges, guess where those Canadian businesses end up unless they choose to pay? They too end up on the slow lane. And so to ensure that Canadian businesses can effectively compete, all businesses should be entitled, all users should be entitled to net neutrality protections that are sufficiently robust as I believe we find here in Canada. We need to think about the approach we take on both data localization and data transfers. It's become one of the more contentious issues around the digital trade chapter, a chapter in which talks about the prospect of of restricting the ability for any individual country to require that the data be maintained, reside locally within the jurisdiction. Now, Canada already has a couple of provinces, British Columbia and Nova Scotia, that have adopted data localization requirements for certain information, things like health data, for example, requiring that it remain locally. One of the risks that Canada faces with provisions in a NAFTA that might restrict our ability to require localization is that at the same time as we agree to a fully open system with no localization requirements, no restrictions on data transfers, we may face increasing pressure from the European Union to establish precisely those kinds of protections. Max Schrems, a lawyer now, former law student who has been active on privacy and surveillance issues in Europe, recently won another case within the European courts addressing specifically questions around data transfers. And so if we find Europe, especially with the GDPR in 2018, increasingly requiring stronger protections with respect to privacy, Canada may find itself in the proverbial privacy rock and a hard place, were the EU, which we did not address within CETA, demanding more restrictions in terms of data transfers, and a NAFTA requiring that we have none. We've got to at least be alive to the issue and ensure that we carve out enough flexibility to protect our privacy in those circumstances. I would argue we should even go further with respect to privacy and recognize that there is already a two-tier approach with respect to privacy protection within the United States for citizens and permanent residents and everyone else. I'm an everyone else, as it happens. And so when our data is transferred into the United States, the kinds of protections that it enjoys is less than those that are either US citizens or permanent residents. Now, the US had been moving towards providing a greater level of protection, but in one of the very first executive orders signed by President Trump, the executive order required that those be scaled back with no further efforts to try to ensure that the privacy protections that US citizens and permanent residents enjoy might be in some fashion be accorded to others, even when that data is there. I see this as a genuine trade barrier. And if we're trying to deal with trade on a North America-wide basis, privacy also becomes that issue if privacy protections aren't afforded to Canadians in the same way that they are to US citizens. And of course, the same would hold true for Mexico. And finally, there's the cultural related concerns. Canada, as part of the TPP, also noted that it was concerned with the approach to culture within the TPP, as it was the first agreement that veered from what has been Canada's conventional approach on culture, was to provide a full exemption for the cultural industries. We've already seen a number of larger US groups say that the time for full cultural protections is long past and Canada ought to open up that market. I'd argue that that's another area where those choices ought to be made domestically, not within trade agreements, and so that an exemption is appropriate. So to conclude, what next for all of this? In the Trans-Pacific Partnership was labeled, I think accurately, as Made in America. That sold well, at least in the United States for a while. It sold less well for the remaining 11 countries who kind of thought that the TPP was supposed to be about about everybody, not just one jurisdiction. We are already seeing within the context of the NAFTA renegotiations much of the same kind of sloganeering. Now, of course, it's let's make NAFTA great again. We're going to make NAFTA great again. I think there are better approaches than we've seen so far with respect, especially in the digital context. I think that where these are domestic issues, we ought to leave it to domestic groups. But if we are going to get engaged on these issues, and as it seems likely that we are, let's recognize first that our priorities may not be the same as the United States on some of these issues. In fact, we align very frequently with many other trading partners on some of these issues, but sometimes they may be inconsistent with the US. It was instructive as part of the TPP that we had strong support from many of the other TPP members when it came to doing things like suspending copyright term extension, suspending the anti-circumvention rules and the like. The reality is that notwithstanding the rhetoric, many of those countries were similarly ill at ease with seeing those kinds of agreements appear in a trade deal. And if NAFTA isn't able to expand those trade agreements and we leave many of these kinds of provisions to our own domestic process, I think that's okay. If we have to deal with these issues, though, balance, from my perspective, ought to be the watchword, and ensuring in a somewhat aggressive fashion, which is atypical, I think, from a Canadian perspective, but I think it is necessary in this case, to ensure that our values, priorities, and policies in the digital environment are reflected in this agreement. The decision to step out or suspend some of those provisions in the TPP, I think, reflected the fact that once that agreement was made public, many looked at that agreement and said these kinds of provisions don't reflect the kinds of policy choices and balancing that we've had over many years of trying to grapple with these issues in Canada. We ought not to make that same mistake again in the NAFTA context. Thanks so much for your attention.
So I have the happy task of thanking Michael Geist for his very rich talk. And in doing so, two thoughts. I guess one is that when Michael loses in his choice of sports teams, it really doesn't matter. In fact, it's almost gratifying. But when he loses, as he said at the start of his talk, in his advice on trade agreements, it matters, and it is not gratifying. In fact, we all, as Canadians, and in fact, many small open economies lose. And so that sort of came across loud and clear in Michael's talk, and also in the various pieces of work that he has done throughout his career, but at CG. He alluded to two. One is the book that I think the compendium you all found on your seats that just was published yesterday, in fact. The other to which he contributed was a collection, I think there's copies outside, on Nafta and IP issues specifically, and connecting those and the gist of that with the exchange he had with John Curtis. It strikes me, and this is where I think these collections lead us, is that this business of meeting international standards. In 1944 and 1945, the global community in some form got together in Bretton Woods and in San Francisco and created, for better or for worse, the processes and institutions that have served us well in global governance for about 70 years or so. And our sense, I think certainly mine, is that we need a Bretton Woods moment. We need a San Francisco moment for the 21st century. And if we have it, it is going to be about exactly all the issues that Michael raised in his talk and in his pieces, and much more. So if data then takes us into a whole range of ethical, political, and cultural, economic issues to do with how we organize ourselves, how production is organized, how we organize societies. And we don't have the conversation space or the framework within which to do it. And that's where I think we're all headed. So thank you, Michael, for a very thought-provoking set of thoughts. This is the last event of its kind this calendar year at the Rideau Club. So thank you all for joining. And we have an exciting slate of such talks next year as well. Larry, you will keep us informed, I know, and keep it all going. Thank you all for joining us this evening. Do stay around. We have a bit of mingling and chat and drinks for about 45 minutes or so. Pick up what you can from CG, and happy holidays in advance.